Iran. Everybody is talking about Iran and the war that is going on there between the United States and Iran, as well as Israel, that's involved. And there is so much destruction that has happened. And the issue with this war is that it has some really global effects, right? So we're going to be discussing all of that here on the Africa for Dummies podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe if you enjoy our content, and be sure to leave a comment down there. We check out every comment, and we would love to hear what you think about what's going on there. And in order to discuss this, we have the I don't know what to call him, the international relations Don Corleone, Mr. Zenge. How are you doing, man?
Yo, international relations Don Corleone. That's very creative. This is
Yeah.
yeah. I'm good, but the world is on fire. So I don't know about the wider geopolitical world, but yeah.
Yeah. So as we discussed in earlier, we are going to be discussing about the Iran-Israel conflict and how it affects Africa in the grand scheme of things. Now, before we dive into that, what we're going to do is we're going to dive into the how this war started and the geopolitical issues, and Zenge is actually going to handle most of that. So Zenge, you can take it away.
Yeah, so I think what's important first is to have a little bit of context as to the relationship between Iran and the US. Okay, let's just mention why we're talking about Iran is because on February the 28th, there was the US and Israeli strike in Tehran, killing the top brass of the Iranian military, but most importantly, the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei. So that's a very big deal in the long history of tensions between the United States, Israel, and Iran. Historically, Iran, before 1979, before the 1979 revolution, there was a big revolution in 1979. Before that, Iran was actually one of the biggest, if not the biggest, US ally in the Middle East, and also a big Israeli ally in the Middle East. It was led by someone somewhat of a king, basically a king known as the Shah at that time. And I think the starting point of that animosity starts when in the early 1950s, there was a prime minister that got elected who wanted to nationalize the oil resources and petroleum. Iran has vast amounts of petroleum reserves and petroleum production. And in the, post World War I era, the United Kingdom, through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, was very powerful and owned the majority of the oil in Iran. And so there's a prime minister that came called Mohammad Mossadegh, in the early 1950s, who became prime minister from 1951 to 53. And he talked about nationalizing and getting a bigger stake for Iranians and Iranian people in their natural resources. As a result of that, the British saw Mossadegh as a threat. And so MI6, British intelligence, as well as American intelligence, the UK sort of pulled in America into that scheme of theirs, because the United States initially, the president at that time was Theodore Roosevelt, initially saw it as British colonial empire ambitions. But the United Kingdom was able to convince the United States that, hey, there's oil here. We both love oil. So let's get on with this plan. What was the plan? The plan was basically to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh. That succeeded. And they reinstalled the Shah. The Shah of Iran then led the country with an iron fist for the next couple of decades until 1979. The Shah of Iran was seen to be more Western aligned, and many of the antagonists of the Shah, which not only included Islamists, but also included left-wing members, also included centrist members who were just anti-monarchy, they saw him as sort of being some kind of puppet for the West, and they also saw him as being in his drive to westernize Iran, right? So there was modernization, which was under the veil of westernization. Modernization, could be infrastructure and so on, but there's also westernization, removing the burqa. Iran is still even at that time was a religious country, but the Shah wanted to um, expedite the how can I say, expedite a westernization type of agenda, uh, on the assumption that it's a modern agenda, similar to Turkey. Turkey had a guy called Ataturk who wanted to modernize, but also ended up westernizing Turkish language, the way they write, changing to the Latin alphabet, um, wanting people to wear suits, wanting women not to wear the burqa, and so on and so forth. So he called it, I think it was called some kind of movement or white revolution, I think. Uh, so he saw himself as a benevolent type of leader, but many of his antagonists saw him as someone that's trying to cause friction with the religious establishment that's at the heart of the Shia element of Islam. You know, there's Sunnis and Shias or Shiites, and that's the Iran is sort of the heartland of that. And so many clerics started opposing him. One of them was a guy called Rola Khomeini. And Rola Khomeini went into exile in France, but over time, people internally caused pressure, and eventually, towards the late 1970s, he was overthrown. In 1979, he was overthrown, and the Rola Khomeini came back, basically almost as leader of Iran. And ultimately, he did become the supreme leader of Iran once they established the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? So it changed from an imperial Iranian empire with shahs, and it moved into a Islamic revolutionary type of republic led by clerics. Many people say Iran is a theocratic state. Yes, that is true. It is somewhat of a there's a word that was used, I think, was syncretic state. So it's a mixture, but primarily we can simplify it and say it's a theocratic state. Meaning it's led by clerics, it's led by religious leaders. Um, and so just to give you an understanding, right now, Iran, basically, the supreme leader is right at the top of the hierarchy. The supreme leader has a say in the judiciary. Who gets appointed the judiciary? The supreme leader also appoints half of the guardian council that is below the judiciary. And then there's also a president and a parliament, which is elected. However, to be president, you have to be vetoed, selected first, be among a list of selected people by the supreme leader, then vetoed by the judiciary, vetoed by the guardian council before you reach the ballot, right? So the president is managerial, but he's not necessarily the ultimate power. And then the supreme leader is also in charge of the armed forces, the army. And then there's the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and then Basij. These are all military elements, right? So the army, there's not only one army, but there's also a pseudo army called the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which under it is the Basij. And then also responsible under the supreme leader's control is broadcasting, foreign policy, war, intelligence, as well as the nuclear file. You know, the United States has talked about Iran making nuclear weapons. So that's there as well. So the supreme leader is really where the power lies. And that's why this war has erupted or been triggered. I say triggered because that's not the origins of the war or the origins of the tension, but this is just the flame, the paraffin to the flame. So that's a general history. I think I've given you pre-Islamic Iran. Okay, so quickly, after the Shah was overthrown in 1979, who was seen as a Western puppet, and one fun fact, which is actually, and I was really obsessed with this at one point, was this big party that he threw, which was worth hundreds of millions of dollars today. Big party in Persepolis. So Iran, the Iranian monarchy had been there for 2,500 years, and that was a big celebration to celebrate 2,500 years of Iranian civilization and dynastic prowess from Cyrus the Great, right? So I think you have heard of Cyrus the Great before, Nathan. You probably read about it somewhere. And so this whole Persian civilization thing was a
Yeah.
big deal, and he had a grand party and invited all these leaders from, you know, emperors, presidents, vice president. It was a big deal. Like, you should really look it up. It's insane. They just went to a desert and just set up 50 tents, luxury tents. Like, you think glamping is something, but that's glamping before glamping. That's like, you know, you walk in and then there's a gigantic portrait of
Yeah.
President Nathan in his room, and it's like you got a servant waiting for it. It's beautiful. I can go on about it. But
Yeah.
that party is important because it was just a few years before the revolution, and it just showed the decadence because people were not invited to that thing. It was just literally the who's who of the world at that time. It was the coming of age of Iran in the 1974, I think 1973. That big party, basically, in the desert. Um, they imported caviar from Paris, lobster, champagne. This is an Islamic country. Um, so it just shows you the contrast of the decadence and then people that were at the receiving end of the hostility of the Shah's secret police, right? And then many groups came, converged. Obviously, 1979 happened. The Shah had to leave, and he died within 1 year, just of his own, sickness and ailments. So Rola Khomeini comes in, and he has been in charge. He's the first supreme leader from 1979 to 1989. During that time, for most of that time, there was a war with Iraq. Iraq at that time was actually an ally of the West, and they were fighting over territorial boundaries in which had actually got a lot of oil and mineral wealth, to put it simply. So at that time, Iran was the enemy of the West. And mind you, also, with regards to the tension in the US and Iran, there was a hostage crisis. Once the Rola Khomeini came in, once the Islamic Revolution happened, a lot of fanatics who came and took over the US embassy and held hostage a lot of US people and diplomats for 444 days, which also resulted in the loss of Jimmy Carter's presidency in 1970, in the 1979 election, which brought in Ronald Reagan. It also resulted in another oil crisis as well that time. So when Iran is upset, it really does affect the world. Because at that time, that was the second major oil crisis. There was one after the 6 Day War between Israel and Arab countries in the early 1970s. Then there was a second one, oil crisis in 1979, right? Um, so the tension really began when that hostage crisis happened. Um, and the funny thing is, we're seeing similarities here because there's reports this time with the war and tension that and this might be relevant to Africans and African Americans. Iranians said they were not at war with African Americans. And African Americans were the first to be released during the hostage crisis in 1979. The white Americans were released after 444 days. Uh, so the 80s was mostly war. It was a very deadly war. You can't really say who won and who lost. The boundaries never changed. So they fought for 8 to 9 years, hundreds and thousands of people dying. Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons also in Iranian people. Um, and so it was a very brutal, bloody war. Children were also part of it. And there was this whole martyrdom thing, which is also important in this war because Iran sort of has this martyrdom narrative and bandwidth, meaning no countries like the United States, if 10 people die, it's a big deal, and the president could get a lot of fire for that. But in Iran, at least so far as the fanatical ability and the clerical ability to muscle up people for their country, you are just a martyr if you die. So you can have thousands if necessary dying, right? I mean, it doesn't sound good for those families where the thousands are going. I saw a documentary on young boys who were like 15 and they wanted to be martyrs. It was like a cool thing to die for your country. So over time, Iran has just maintained that level of hostility. It was called the axis of evil. So since then, the US's attention, whilst it has maintained this hostility, the US's attention has shifted to different things over time. The war on terror, the war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, ISIS, and so on and so forth. Uh, but Iran has maintained a level of hostility with the United States. During Obama's presidency, they tried to have an Iranian nuclear. So after that war, there was a level of mistrust for everyone, for the Arabs, the Gulf states, the United States, and so on and so forth. So Iran was like, oh, let's just do what countries do for those countries that have never seen someone, for those countries that have never had a president overthrown or killed, have nuclear weapons. North Korea style. Nothing happens. North Korea is never invited to these events, to these, let me not call them events, wars, because they have nuclear weapons, all right? Even if it's minimal, I'm sure North Korea knows very well that they will die. It's obviously called mutually assured destruction, MAD, but some people also call it poisonous tree frog strategy, such that even if you eat me, you will die in the process of eating me. Or porcupine strategy, even as you try and eat me, your entire face will be bloody and disfigured. I will die, guaranteed, but the cost of trying to kill me will just be too much for you, such that you will reconsider. So
Uh-huh.
naturally, a country would think, oh, let's have nuclear weapons. So for a while, Iran did try have nuclear facilities and capacity for military means, but the joint JCPOA, so that's the acronym for it. We could probably write it down here. During the Obama years, to come up with terms on how Iran can reduce its nuclear enrichment strategy and programs in exchange for reducing the sanctions, economic sanctions. Donald Trump came on in 2017. He was elected in 2017, right? No, he became president in 2017. In 2018, he pulled out of the nuclear deal, basically. And because many people would attribute that probably to Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu has been very steadfast. He really hated the nuclear agreement. It was a nuclear agreement involving the United States. Imagine, this sounds weird, but all of these powers were in the room. United States, China, Russia, all of these countries are present. European Union. I don't think you can sign any nuclear deal today
Well,
with all those countries involved. Imagine sitting at the table there, you
yeah.
got Iran, China, European Union, Russia. That's insane. So that was different
Hmm.
times. So that was the last attempt. And then came mass protests. Obviously, the October 7 event was a big deal. It was a big deal, and the relevance to Iran is that Iran has a lot of proxies aligned with it, and the proxies are aligned with it, like Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's got the Houthis in Yemen, and it's during the reign of Bashar al-Assad. It also had a close sort of affiliation with Bashar al-Assad's regime, and Iranian aligned forces would also prop him up. Um, in Iraq, they have huge stakes in the government, because Iraq is a majority Shiite country. And Lebanon is very mixed. So there's Shiites, Sunnis, Christians. Hezbollah managed to, ever since the 1980s, carved out a part of southern Lebanon where they are ready to attack Israel. And Israel has consistently had to fight that as well. And Hezbollah intensified its ammo towards Israel after October 7, and that war that has seen the um, deaths of tens of thousands of people, to which it's, even a genocide case has been levied against them. So that becomes another aspect. And then domestically, there's economic problems with inflation, cost of living, cost of fuel within Iran. And mass protests started in December 2025 towards into January. And many of those sort of warmongers, or those who would love to see the end of the Islamic regime or establishment, were almost drooling in anticipation for the fall of that regime. And one of them is remember when I talked about the Shah, now his son, yeah, who would have been the Shah today, has established himself in the diaspora as a very prominent voice of anti-Islamic Republic of Iran, right? And he has seemed to be aligned very closely with Israel, with the United States. He basically shakes hands with whoever might support him in his ambitions. But that's not to say that people domestically, even if they might not agree with the current regime in Iran, they might not necessarily agree with him either, because he still represents the Shah. He still represents monarchy and the Shah's era, which not necessarily is perfectly good, even though some might look at it as better than what there is now. And he has been very cautious not to say, "I want to reestablish the monarchy," right? But he definitely sees himself somewhere in a new type of dispensation, if there was to be one. Um, So that seemed to be withering down actually by February. And then the next thing we know is the Ali Khamenei, who took over from 1989 and had been in charge ever since, or was killed on the 28th of February after 36 years and 8 months of leading Iran. And after 8 days, they elected his son, Mojtaba Khamenei. And so there's a degree of continuity here. I think many people expected some kind of complete collapse of a system, but the system seems to be able to survive. It's now on its third leader. But one thing that people are pointing out is that these guys overthrew a monarchy, and now there is inheritance going on between these two. So those are some observations that look a bit ironic. So yeah, in response, Iran has sent thousands and thousands of missiles. That I think you know what you see on the news. Yeah, they've attacked Gulf countries in which they have U.S. military bases. Those countries, many of those countries, for the last 20, 30 years, have staked their security policy around bandwagoning with the United States. And sort of funny thing is, Qatar actually hasn't always been bandwagoning perfectly with the United States. So they had actually relatively good relations with Iran. But the thing is, they still have a U.S. military base, and the U.S. uses that base, one of the biggest bases, to attack. So they have not been exempt from attacks. Even countries that have been quite neutral and or facilitating negotiations for nuclear, after the protests in December, January, Iran was started negotiations on around the nuclear enrichment, and Iran deliberately talks about enriching its nuclear program whenever it's in the corner. It always dangles it there, just like, oh,
Mhm.
if you try me, I'm going to actually do this. I'm going to do it. And then it's like, oh, okay, don't do it. Let's talk. That's the only thing that I think from their point of view,
Mhm.
they see as the one thing that the United States will actually listen to. So now you have lots of bombing of countries from the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, obviously Saudi Arabia, and there's then the economic crisis, and 20% of the world's oil, massive amounts of natural gas come from that Strait of Hormuz, which is a sort of choke point area where very few ships can pass at the same time, and so it's very easy to shut it down. That's how we got here.
Yeah, thanks a lot for thanks a lot for that summary of what's going on and how we got to this point. I think it's a testament to how things in one particular region, even though they're very far away from you, can still have a huge impact on you. And as this is the Africa for Dummies show, we're going to discuss how this particular war, the Iran war, with the United States and Israel as well, is affecting African nations. So I really don't know where to start because there's quite a lot of information on how the war is going to impact or is impacting many African states. And of course, the number one is oil, right? I mean, um, a lot of the value chains or supply chains that we have are really dependent on oil. Even the very oil that we have is brought on trucks by by oil. The trucks use oil, and as you mentioned, about 20%, or is it somewhere around 38% of the world's crude oil is actually has to go through the Strait of Hormuz, right? And as you mentioned, Iran as a strategic objective has choked or has closed the Strait of Hormuz. Now, when we talk about the crude oil fact, I think a lot of people are going to be surprised that the fact that many African nations are actually importers of oil, right? So a lot of people will think, well, don't we have Angola? Don't we have Nigeria? But the issue with this is that Nigeria and Angola are exporters of raw crude oil, right? And then they have to import I don't know about Angola specifically, but Nigeria exports the raw oil, but has to import the processed oil. It still is a huge opportunity, particularly for these countries that produce this crude oil. For example, as I mentioned, Angola, Namibia. I think another one that many people some people have been discussing is Uganda, which is also supposed to start producing oil, and I think October is where they stated the is when they stated that they will start production of oil. But of course, at the moment, I don't think they're producing anything. Um, yeah, so as I mentioned before, a lot of oil prices are probably going to spike. So I think the last statistic I looked at, they uh, were at $70 per barrel, and they went in early March. They were at around 110%, at 110 US dollars. So that's one way that people are going to feel this, is that the price of oil is going to spike, and of course, at the moment, many people are panic buying, which also can further push the price of oil, because people are sort of anticipating this increase in oil if this war, which initially I think the United States thought wasn't going to last that long, but it's starting to look like this might drag on for very long. And even if this war was to stop, the damage that is done to these oil supply chains and even the region, I think it will still take a long time before we get back to the norm.
I am an African.